As South Africa marks Youth Month, many young people in the country still find themselves without employment. About 45% of people aged between 15 and 34 years are jobless, and many are looking to the 7th administration for solutions. The National Youth Development Agency CEO, Wasim Karim, joins us now more on that conversation. Wasim, good evening, and thank you very much for your time.
Good evening, Thabo. Good evening to your viewers as well.
Jobs emerging as one of the key election issues, if you like, a hot button issue, even trumping the 2019 elections in terms of them being a touch point. When you look at those statistics and where they are sitting right now, do you think, I mean, since the inception of the NYDA, you have done enough for the young people? I mean, those numbers seem to suggest the opposite, though.
Yeah, thanks, Thabo. That's a very important question, right? And I think if we are to have a balanced conversation about young people and employment and unemployment, if we were to limit that conversation to just the NYDA, we would not do the subject matter enough justice, right? Simply because the NYDA makes up about 1% of government's annual expenditure when it comes to developmental work. So we're a small cog in a very large machine where young people make up almost 40% of the population in South Africa. So when we have this conversation, it's important for us to have a conversation that encompasses education, both basic and higher, social services to young people, skills development, as well as the role of the private sector and civil society. Yeah. Now, when we have that conversation, we find that there's one primary reason why we have such high levels of unemployment in South Africa, and that largely is because the South African economy has not grown at any meaningful rate. We used to talk about a decade. We're now going into the second decade of lack of economic growth in the country, right? And there is a correlation between economic growth and employment or unemployment. It's no stranger that when our economy was growing in 2008, we had the lowest jobless rates. Yes, 22% was still relatively high, but it's way lower than where we see ourselves right now. Yeah. So amongst everything, we have to get this economy growing if we're going to create jobs at the scale that we want to be able to service young people. Of course, that is the primary reason, but there's many secondary reasons, right? Challenges in our education system, both basic and higher, very high dropout rates and low throughput rates, lower levels of entrepreneurship than the rest of the world. And really, I think the way South Africa is set up developmentally is we've actually got good developmental institutions. But the challenge is that if we don't have an economy that's moving in the right direction, our public services are so stretched between different competing interests of health and social development that even our efforts at unemployment are going to miss the mark, because we just don't have enough resources to be able to go around to address the fundamental challenge that young people face. Yeah.
Yeah. 15 years on, I mean, from the time when you came in 2009 and pronounced by President Jacob Zuma in his State of the Nation address, do you think the mandate that you were given is still relevant to the levers that you are pulling at? For example, your contributions towards eradicating poverty by granting civil society some funds, and you would have things like the package that young people can get to come from you, have their CVs done, others have their business plans done, and so on and so forth. Do you think those things are still relevant, or is it time for you to go and refresh your approach to this mandate?
So I think there's no better time to talk about freshness than when you enter a new administration, right? And in a new administration where the South African electorate has really pronounced on something different than what they've done at any time in South Africa's democratic history, right? So do I think that there are institutions that developmentally need to be ring-fenced to support young people? Absolutely. I think young people make up such a large cohort of the South African society. I think they face unique challenges that need specific solutions that are designed by young people who understand those challenges that they face. But there's a second answer to that I want to give. Is the South African state fit for purpose to support the needs of young people? And I don't think it is, right? If I look at the size of the state, yeah, and the amount of duplication that happens across the government departments, across public entities, we have 700 public entities in South Africa, some of them with overlapping mandates and duplication, which does not create any element of effectiveness or efficiency. When we do an assessment of youth programs, we find that there's 282 different youth employment programs. Yeah, that's too many. What we need to be able to solve the challenge is 4 or 5 very large-scale programs that seek to address the problem that we're facing. So absolutely, there's a great deal of rethinking, freshness, effectiveness, and efficiency that could be introduced into the system that would really refresh a lot of the initiatives that government has, and it will be able to support much more young people and support them in many better ways. Yeah?
Now, we've seen in the build up to the elections a lot of jobs being announced. For example, Nasi Spani, we've seen the UIF coming on board as well, announcing some kind of job creation scheme that they are on. And these strategies are all saying we are aiming at the youth, but they seem to be fragmented in the way that they are done. Others would say they seem to be politicized, particularly around the campaigns. But now that the dust has settled, is there a way of collating all those jobs, having a much more structured way of being able to ensure that young people benefit from them in a meaningful way, including the president's initiative?
Yeah, but again, a really key issue, and I'm glad we're debating the policy issues, right? And I want to start off by looking at it ideologically to some extent, right? Do we want in South Africa to have a society where our young people must queue in a queue every month to receive a 370 Rand grant? Or do we want a society where young people work, yeah? Where they have something to offer to this country, where they wake up in the morning and they feel like they have a place to go, right? And I think unilaterally or unanimously we'll shift towards the latter, right? Which means that work matters in society. Work has more value than just economic in nature, particularly for young people. It's a key element of the social fabric in society, right? So where the state is creating employment opportunities, particularly where those add value, community healthcare workers, young people working in early childhood development, young people working as artisans, yeah. Those programs have a large degree of value, yeah, and they're very important, both to young people as well as to society. Where I think we need to be very focused in what we do is we need to avoid fragmentation. So instead of having singular programs that belong to individuals, we need to have much more consolidation around these programs, right? That's one. Number two, we need to look at the length of these programs. Generally, if you employ a young person for 3 to 6 months, that is not sufficient time for them to gain a stronger foothold to be able to transition into more longer term forms of employment. So generally 10 to 12 months, even 12 to 24 months, a much better period to support a young person, right? And the third element that's very critical in nature is what you'll often hear young people say is that they get this short-term hope from being employed in these programs, only to have that taken away when the program comes to an end. So when a young person enters, we need to be collectively working much closer with the private sector, but also working on entrepreneurial exits with these young people, so that when they leave programs, whether they be Nasi Sepani, the Presidential Employment Stimulus, the UIF programs, we are focusing on the longer forms of unemployment. So young people don't feel like they have the short-term hope only to be let down at the end of it. Yeah.
The National Youth Policy 2030, I mean, is that still your goalpost? Is that still what you are focusing on and aiming towards? And how does it speak, for example, to the Bella bill that is now being discussed in the corridors of the National Assembly?
Yeah, I think South Africa still remains committed to the National Development Plan 2030. Aligned to that is the National Youth Policy 2030, as well as the Integrated Youth Development Strategy, right? Now, I am sure with an incoming 7th administration, the expectation is that this administration will pronounce on a renewed vision for young people in society, yeah? And a vision that, of course, leads up to 2029, but probably closer to 2030. Now, most economists will tell you that we're very far away from the targets set in the National Development Plan, and probably most of those targets need to be adjusted, right? But I do think that there are very positive things that we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years. I'll just give you one example, right? One of the things we always used to talk about is the retention rate in the basic education system. We used to say that 1 in 2 young people who starts out in basic education does not end up sitting for their matric examinations. Now, over the last few years, we've seen that retention rate improve much better, to the point where 70%, we're not where we should be, but we are improving. We're seeing incremental improvements. So I think across the divide, basic education, higher education, employment, social services for young people, healthcare, we're going to see a renewed vision coming from the 7th administration. We're going to see, hopefully, fresher ideas. And what I really hope for is more accountability in the system, yeah? Because I think young people deserve better 30 years after democracy landed in South Africa.
Somebody would say, I mean, what is the NYDA, for example, doing to highlight and elevate the status of youth development institutions? I mean, sitting here right now, I'm not the youth, I probably wouldn't know, but I don't know of many of them that the young people, I can easily send a young person to and say, go to that institution. It will certainly assist you, it will be effective, and it will respond to your challenges.
No, I think it's a very fair question, right? And it comes back to my initial point, is to say, where you have a lack of a growing economy, your tax revenues become very stretched in nature. So if you think back to a time when South Africa's economy was growing and we were really the center of the world, we were expanding at a rapid pace, right? We were hiring more teachers, we were hiring more nurses, we were building more clinics, we were building schools. And when the economy stops growing, your public services start to get very stretched, right? So you've got to do much more with less. Now, for example, just to take one example, and I'm not debating the merits or the demerits, but you take something like the Social Relief of Distress grant, the spending on that crowds out spending in other areas that you could potentially spend on, right? And many people feel that, rather than all of these, what some people might refer to as artificial employment programs, expanded public works or community works, we should just pay a basic income grant to everybody. Now, there's people who believe in that, there's other people who don't, yeah? But I think the reality you're faced is that you're faced with a very stretched public sector. And the reality is, right now, you're not able to assist every young person who may need it, essentially, yeah? And I think that is where we need to address one issue, the issue of economic growth. But I also think it's where we need to take hard decisions, right? Because I think we could get to a point where we are able to assist the majority of young people. But it requires hard decisions in terms of what we continue with and what we're willing to shut down, yeah.
Wasim, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Wasim Karim, Chief Executive Officer of the National Youth Development Agency.